I think we're going to get started. I feel like I'm far away from the mic though. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Okay, so we're starting the second half of the session. I'm going to give just a short 15-minute-ish talk. Hopefully it's less. And then we're going to turn to Alejandra Schrader, our guest chef, who will give a talk, and then we'll have a tasting, which is out in the hallway. So we'll shuffle out there after her talk so she can talk about what she is presenting food-wise. So as I mentioned, I'm John De La Parra from the Rockefeller Foundation, and because of that, I have the driest and most boring part of the presentation, but I actually find it really interesting. So I'm going to talk about the advances that have been made in open and equitable sharing of DSI, or digital sequence information. Hopefully some of you are really interested in this topic. It is a very contentious, fraught topic. So for those of you that are interested, it's really exciting, and I'm super interested. And I've obviously, through my portfolio, we funded a lot of work in this to help settle how this will eventually turn out. So I'm kind of reporting to you from COP15, which happened in Montreal. It was supposed to happen in Kunming, China. So it's called the Kunming Montreal convening on we call it the Biodiversity COP, the Convention of the Parties on the CBD. So I'm reporting some of what happened there, some of that as a consequence of our investments to kind of help untangle this issue. And there's also connections to PTFI. So we're going to go through, but for those of you that aren't familiar with all of these topics, I'll spend just a tiny bit of time talking about some of the definitions and the landscape generally, and then what would be the impacts for you doing work in ethnobotany and some of the work of PTFI as well. So what is DSI? So it's digital sequence information, but what is it is hotly contested. So you might think, oh, it's genetic sequences, right? I mean, at its base, I would say yes, it is genetic sequences, but it could also be almost any digital information attached to a biological resource as we think of it under the Nagoya Protocol or the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's not an international standard definition for DSI. And in our broad interpretation with the PTFI, we want to be as inclusive as possible for the type of sensitivities that might arise from any digital information attached to a biological resource. So we are thinking, well, chemical information is a likely extension of this type of interpretation. But if you think broadly, it could be a lot of things. It could be photos of foods. It could be, the digital stories of food. The definitions could be very wide, and we need both open and equitable sharing of these data. So it's a delicate balance, and there are people on both sides and very few trying to come to some sort of reasonable compromise. So that's where the fact that in the work that I've been doing at the foundation has been kind of trying to bring these sides together and talk about this. We've had a few convenings around the world to discuss this topic. And where this really comes to a crux is through various fora, because this issue of DSI has really come to a head since 2013. And the four main fora through which DSI is discussed is the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, which most of you probably know a lot about through the Nagoya Protocol and others, the ITPGRFA, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which we just call the treaty for those of you that work probably in biocultural collections or with food. We just call it the treaty or the plant treaty. The World Health Organization, WHO, that is important because DSI also gets attached to viruses and other things that might be of biological origin and considered a biological resource. And then the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which helps regulate how, in a multilateral system, how do you differentiate between different countries' laws? So at least those four fora are where this is most hotly talked about. So when we invest in trying to untangle this, we have to have considerations for all of these different things. Okay, so access and benefit sharing. This has been in discussion since at least the 1950s, and it usually has traditionally referred to physical genetic resources. So if you collect a plant in some country, how do you provide access and benefit sharing so that there are benefits returned to the people, the culture from which those physical genetic resources were taken? But again, the question has remained open. What about the digital resources, which remain right now on hard drives, especially in the US and Europe? How do we equitably share those data? How, do we use it at all? And there have been many ways, even for the physical sharing of genetic resources, for access and benefit sharing. It usually is either bilateral or multilateral. For Nagoya, by its nature is bilateral. So it's supposed to be country to country negotiations. So, you know, if a researcher from one country wants to use a genetic resource, those two countries have to talk to each other and decide how how will access and benefit sharing be played out. However, of course, in the US, we're not a signatory of Nagoya, so it becomes much more complicated, and it usually is just an ethical practice that is adopted by institutions or organizations that, or maybe a journal says you have to have abided by Nagoya in order to publish. So it's not the same as it is in signatories to Nagoya. And then, but what would perhaps be more ideal, depends on who you talk to, might be a multilateral system where you don't have to have all of these particular negotiations between countries, but there is some system through which resources are accumulated and distributed. And then there's some decision-making body that allows for the redistribution of those resources. The idea is that perhaps that would be easier and it could be more equitable, because if you think about Brazil under Bolsonaro, were the resources going back to indigenous people? Probably not, right? But the government controls how those resources would be distributed. But under a multilateral system, there might be an opportunity to redistribute resources directly to communities. So now access and benefit sharing and DSI coming together. So discussions really just stopped in 2019, and especially as COVID started to ramp up in early 2020, there were a number of meetings that were supposed to happen that did not because of COVID. And then this became deprioritized because of a number of other priorities happening in the world. And it fell off the radar from being a very heated topic that was, you know, converging towards some solution to just not being discussed very much. But now, as I mentioned, there was a Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties. There's a lot of acronyms I'll be using, but CBD COP15 in Montreal. The discussion was around a few of these things. So would it be bilateral or multilateral? Would we have the same mechanisms across instruments, and instruments meaning the fora that I was talking about, so the different agreements that have been made amongst countries? Should researchers and communities affected by this be able to go to one place to access and share benefits from the use of DSI? And each of these instruments has been discussing this in various different ways, but the idea is that we come to some kind of mutually supportive agreement that would have some resolution. So I'm just going to briefly buzz through the international fora. So CBD, again, the one that you probably are most familiar with if you're an ethnobotanist, the Convention on Biological Diversity. DSI is now part of the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and it is part of a separate decision. So there's two pieces through which this Global Biodiversity Framework is discussed. Between now and 2024, the parties are going to create a multilateral system for DSI access and benefit sharing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources, Food and Agriculture, or the treaty, within the treaty, they reopen discussions on DSI through a number of working groups that they hold throughout the year. And they really also are very interested in a multilateral system. And they're also aligning a final decision on how they will, you know, finally do this around 2025, which is when also the next COP will happen. COP16 will happen in Turkey in 2025, and when a lot of this will be more finally resolved. The World Health Organization, I mentioned viruses as another very important genetic resources that would be under digital sequence information. So there's been a lot of discussion about this being part of the pandemic information preparedness framework, and they see it as a key role in One Health. And then the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. So again, this is where many different laws of different countries intersect. DSI is it has been recognized as part of biodiversity beyond jurisdictional discussions at the Convention on the Law of the Seas. So they're also converging on kind of this multilateral thinking. So what I think is the most important part of this report out to you is the actual language that has been adopted. So I think I should just read it, and I'll read it more slowly than I'm talking, what the actual outcomes are. So again, this was what has been called in the press the Global Biodiversity Framework that was passed in December at COP15, but it's the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And under Goal C, and you can see there's 4 goals, I believe, A, B, C, and D, this is what it says: the monetary and non-monetary benefits from the utilization of genetic resources and genetic or digital sequence information on genetic resources and of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources as applicable are shared fairly and equitably, including as appropriate with indigenous peoples and local communities, and substantially increased by 2050, while ensuring traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources is appropriately protected, thereby contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in accordance with internationally agreed access and benefit sharing instruments. So that was really hard fought out. Just so you know, every word of this was really hard fought out and is a major pillar of this agreement. And it, very importantly for our work as ethnobotanists, it does include digital sequence information as part of the goal. So important to consider. The other part where it's mentioned is target 13, and I believe there are 15 targets. And I'm going to read this one too, because each of these will be critical to your work likely in the future. So, take effective legal, policy, administrative, and capacity building measures at all levels as appropriate to ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the utilization of genetic resources and from digital sequence information on genetic resources, as well as traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, and facilitating appropriate access to genetic resources, and by 2030, facilitating a significant increase of the benefits shared in accordance with applicable international access and benefit sharing instruments. So again, there's definitely this inclusion of digital sequence information with our concept of what biological resources are. And I'll say, having held many convenings around the world with groups on what might be considered both sides. So both sides would be many representatives from traditional and indigenous communities and governments from areas that have higher biodiversity. I don't want to say versus, but then on the other side is, researchers and corporations that want to make sure that these data are maximally useful, be able to be used. But when we talk to them, including DSI as part of our genetic, as the definition of biological resources, was actually pretty universally accepted. So what is here is actually very much the consensus thinking on both sides of this issue from my view of having been in this for a couple of years. There was also a separate decision specifically on DSI. So there's a working group on DSI. Separate decision is this. So it specifically outlines, and this is important because this is what's going to be happening at COP 16 in Turkey in 2025. Specifically outlines a process over the next 2 years to explore the design of a multilateral DSI ABS system. Okay, so there'll be an actual process in place to do this. It notes the potential need to create a global fund for sharing benefits derived from the use of DSI. So that would mean, as I mentioned before, paying into some general pool, and there'd be an administrator of some type that would help distribute those funds. And that there'll be numerous opportunities for stakeholders, including researchers, to get involved in the process over the next 2 years. And several of those convenings have happened. We'll be holding a convening that we're funding in Cali, Colombia in September, specifically around traditional indigenous knowledge holders to help solidify and shore up their position as they go into negotiations in COP 16 next year. So what are the impacts for ethnobotanists? So, and that's might be what you're most interested in. So first, accessing and using DSI. So as I mentioned, for anyone that's based in the US is not a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So anything that goes through that forum, The actual legal implications are less, although we still uphold a higher ethical obligation to some of these agreements. And I think that institutions will adopt the higher standard. The US is a contracting party of the treaty, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, and a party to the World Health Organization, and also intends to join this group called the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And they're all interested in this solution. So again, this is where the momentum is going. Whatever regulations are directly going to affect how scientists collect, share, access, publish all these data. So it's something to keep in mind in the coming years. The definition of DSI, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there isn't one, right? Like there is not an internationally recognized cohesive definition of DSI. Different countries have different definitions, and some extend to digital collections of traditional knowledge, phenotyping characteristics. So it goes well beyond just DNA sequences, right? It can be a lot of things, including chemical composition, which is what the PTFI is collecting. And that's a repeat. And then benefit sharing. So perhaps the most important part. So depending on the source of the materials, there may be requirements for a number of different types of benefits, but they usually fall into either monetary benefits, so directly paying for specific resources, or non-monetary benefits. So that often that's in the form of some sort of capacity strengthening, perhaps education and other things. There are lots of models, and PTFI is really, I think, on the cutting edge of how to do this before this is even decided. So Selena mentioned a few times Good Food U, the Good Food Fellows. That is specifically focused on our centers of excellence that are in these high biodiversity countries around the world to provide capacity strengthening as a form of non-monetary benefit sharing. And we're exploring other possibilities as well. So I'll stop there, and maybe we'll take questions now for just 2 or 3 minutes. But thank you. Yes. In the back, yeah. Oh. Oh, WIPO? Oh yeah, no, I just out of brevity, but yes, WIPO is actually a key. So the question was whether we include WIPO, WIPO in why it wasn't included here. But no, we're absolutely working with them. I'm sorry for the omission, but just out of brevity of the major, especially in the US, like who is being interacted with, but they're absolutely at the table. Yeah. Yeah, Diane. There's a microphone coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I have a question and a comment. So at the National Tropical Botanical Garden where I work, we commercialized some breadfruit varieties that had been collected over the decades, working with a commercial horticultural company, and we set up a mechanism with the country of origin of those varieties, which were collected back in the 70s, to share 50-50 any monies we receive for the sale of the plants. So how does that fit into us doing that kind of just as a botanical garden with a various government? And we worked at the government level, not with a conservation organization. How does that fit into this? And is it, the right direction to be going, or could we be doing something differently?
Was that American Samoa? Or...
no, the independent country of Samoa. Oh, okay. And also a state in the Federated States of Micronesia.
Okay. I mean, I hate to say this, but I think it's to be determined. So as you can see, these are very much being negotiated term by term. There will be there'll be some resolution in 2025 with the meeting of COP16 around exactly how this will be set up. What I would say, though, is that it's likely that U.S. botanical gardens will not be compelled to do anything new. It will be whether their directors decide to adopt this new kind of ethical standard around digital sequence information. I would imagine that there's going to be provisions on grandfathering in resources as well, or collections as well. So that's my feeling. I think that most of this will apply to new research going forward, because it would be really difficult to claw back some of this stuff. if it is going to go retroactively, that's all got to be figured out. And it will depend on specific countries' motivations as well, I think. So yeah, I think it's too specific to know exactly now how it's going to impact. But I think you're probably basically fine because unfortunately the US hasn't signed the Convention on Biological Diversity. So.
Right. Well, we look more at the International Treaty for Plant
Right.
Genetic Resources.
Oh, okay. Well,
And-
they're really on top of stuff. So
Right.
you'll hear something from them before.
Right, but we
anybody else.
didn't do it through their multilateral system. We did it independently.
Okay.
So that's, again, part of the US, we weren't compelled to do it, but we did it because it was the absolute right thing to do.
Right. And that's what I think will be the trend amongst educational institutions, botanical gardens, is that this will come out, it'll be in the press at some point, and then people will start having workshops, figuring out how they're going to handle their digital collections, whether it's pictures of herbarium specimens. I mean, who knows? Is it, it can be really, it depends, right? It can be a lot of things. So it's beyond, and I know some people are probably getting a headache hearing this. I see Wendy. Yeah. So, but know that there are parties on both sides discussing this, right? So, and that something needs to happen with this. There are new resources that we need to figure out how they're shared equitably.